It may seem like an exaggeration, but Half-Life was actually one of the very first games to grant virtually uninterrupted control to the player. There are no cutscenes, walls of text, or excitement-halting loading screens in Half-Life, even as the player reaches new chapters and environments. Instead, the game uses scripted sequences which cause certain events to take place in-engine without stopping the player's game whenever the player cues certain situations through their actions. Half-Life was released to American and European audiences in November of 1998, the same month that Nintendo fans were experiencing the first real open-world action RPG, and Sony fans were witnessing the birth of the stealth action genre. For the production of Half-Life, Valve had licensed id Software's Quake engine, though intensely modified it for the sake of skeletal animations, more complex AI, and far more advanced visual acuity. Despite the adopted engine, 75% of the final code of Half-Life was still estimated to be created by Valve themselves. Originally, Half-Life was intended to be released in late 1997 as a competitor to Quake 2. However, Valve determined that the game was not fun enough, despite its impressive level design and interesting weapons. Reworking several of the game's stages, the team constructed a 3-point thesis on what made an interesting level. First was that interesting things would happen based on the player's actions rather than a timer. Second was the level's ability to respond to the player's actions, all the way down to bullet hole textures and walls. And third was the context of warning the player to imminent danger rather than subjecting them to damage without the chance to defend themselves. After constructing this baseline, the rest of the game was intensely workshopped with these concepts in mind. According to Valve co-founder Gabe Newell, Half-Life was expected to reach roughly 180,000 sales. However, after a surprisingly successful holiday season in 1998, with multiple weeks at the top of the gaming charts, Half-Life reached over 500,000 copies sold roughly 2 months after release. By April of 1999, it had surpassed 1 million. Following its release, Half-Life was heralded as being instantly recognizable as a revolutionary title for the first-person shooter genre, as well as gaming as a whole. Much like its spiritual predecessor, Quake, Half-Life also inspired numerous mods and spin-offs, which even became a few of their own standalone games, such as Counter-Strike and Day of Defeat. Beyond its direct successors, Half-Life also became one of the most influential games in the first-person shooter genre, and you may begin to understand just how many common gaming features were introduced by Valve as we uncover what's so great about Half-Life. In Half-Life, players assume the role of mute protagonist Gordon Freeman, a 27-year-old theoretical physicist working for the Black Mesa Research Facility, on a day fated for chaos and excitement outside of his typical lab work. During a volatile experiment involving their anti-mass spectrometer, the Black Mesa facility is severely damaged and invaded by horrific creatures from another dimension. Freeman, one of the few capable and surviving scientists following the incident, works his way back to the surface as the player struggles to find a way to reverse the consequences of this failed experiment. Unfortunately, he'll also have to sneak and fight his way through a specialized unit of the United States Marines who have been sent to cover up this calamity, which includes eliminating any of the scientists involved at Black Mesa. The developers at Valve were heavily inspired by id Software's revolutionary first-person shooter, Doom, and wanted Half-Life to scare the player in a similar manner, through a horrific yet much more immersive, action-packed world. Valve hired science fiction writer Mark Laidlaw to pen the game's script. Laidlaw remained involved at Valve until his departure in 2016, after working on several Half-Life titles. While I think the major beats of the story are a bit predictable, the writing itself is still terrific. All of the dialogue makes sense without being too technical or wordy, and supplies a succinct degree of world building within its instructions to the player. Before they select their difficulty, players are presented with a training room, teaching players with an obstacle course and shooting range that the way they move around the world will greatly matter when they find themselves in particular situations, such as crouch jumping through tight spaces like vents and pipes, or sprint jumping over larger gaps, just like in a platformer game. Players also are introduced to Half-Life's wall-mounted healing stations and a wide variety of ballistic and explosive weaponry. Rather than the genre-dominating format of assigning weapons to the number keys from first to last acquired, the player's equipment in Half-Life is categorized by similar uses, such as sidearms, two-handed guns like rifles or shotguns, and single-use equipment like grenades and other explosives. However, it would still be a couple years until the release of Halo Combat Evolved when melee attacks and grenades became their own separate functions from weaponry and could be used at any time. The hotkey groupings used to swap between weapons of similar functions are very smooth and convenient, in order to keep you from having to scroll through every option in the heat of battle or move your hand to a distant number key while focusing on movement. Uncommon for this era of first-person games, our playable character actually has hands and forearms which appear in the player's line of sight, rather than just the barrel of a gun or maybe a pixelated fist. This is also one of the earliest instances, aside from GoldenEye 007 on the N64, of the main character visibly reloading their weapon, changing the pace of the game's action to accommodate more realistic parameters of firearms. This break in the player's offense encouraged more use of cover while reloading for more engaging standoffs, as well as the mentality of double-checking your equipment during moments of rest. The balance between fighting soldiers who use guns or alien mutants who use nothing but flailing arms makes the player much more strongly consider which weapons they themselves should use in each confrontation. There's limited ammunition to go around as several factions fight for control and survival across the Black Mesa compound, so choosing their weapons based on surroundings, enemy movements, and available firepower will greatly impact how much the player struggles through this adventure. In some instances, such as underwater, only certain weapons or pieces of equipment will work, so this concept of preservation of ammo becomes even more important when the player doesn't know where they'll find themselves next. For an early PC shooter game, Half-Life has a significant amount of puzzles, usually involving powering generators, finding your way through maze-like structures, and piecing together rail pieces for transportation around environmental hazards and enemies. It requires a lot more focus and thought from its players than a comparably successful predecessor like Doom. Even without swarming the player with endless waves of demons, the game still feels fast-paced, with NPCs who demonstrate fear and desperation, as well as a very demanding flow of gameplay, which still requires players to manage health, battery life, and ammunition for substantial periods between safe zones. Distancing itself from the fast-paced, action-packed origins of the first-person shooter genre, Half-Life provides an experience that's much less frustrating than some of its predecessors, and simply more fun to just play, as in wander around and fully explore at your own pace between the story and action. This was a nice feature found in full-scale adventure games or RPGs, but certainly not common in shooters at the time. There's not really as much of a point in stopping to enjoy the decor in Quake as there is in Half-Life's interconnected and well-structured world of laboratories, sewers, arid surfaces, and other industrial labyrinths. In fact, Half-Life is basically the first time that there are just things in the same space as the player, other than monsters or enemies. There are crates and mechanical equipment and just set dressings that make the world feel much more alive than the synthetic mazes found in Doom and Quake. The Black Mesa facility is also massive. Valve did a good job of demonstrating this fact right away with the railway system that Gordon takes to his laboratory, but the rooms and outdoor settings just grow larger and more complex as the game continues, with several natural and man-made structures for the player to explore. The use of radioactive materials create bright green sources of light which illuminate the levels in a much more interesting and slightly less straining manner than the brimstone, torchlight, and other dim settings of most first-person shooters up until this point. Not to mention, this feels like one of the earliest first-person shooters to actually embrace sunlight over darkness. I really wish there had been more above-ground segments, as the majority of the game features the player sneaking through sewer tunnels, underground bases, and other horror sci-fi settings. Nonetheless, these segments of bright blue skies actually felt incredibly refreshing upon reaching in-game, because the first-person shooter genre had been dominated by demons and aliens for the majority of its existence. And while Half-Life barely strayed from that overall theme, Valve still found more opportunities for diverse, interesting settings for the player to explore. With its well-paced ebb and flow between firefights and environmental puzzles, Half-Life portrays a much more tense experience than the non-stop demon-shooting action found in most first-person shooters of its time. You never know if an enemy will be around the corner, so you can't entirely let your guard down. but the occasional pouncing head crab will startle even the most experienced player if they're too focused on a puzzle in front of them. This accomplishes the general horror sensation that Valve had set out to create without the use of scripted jump scares or cheap thrills. At release, many critics and gaming review publications gave Half-Life exceptionally high praise, and nearly, if not perfect scores, with several groups voting it one of the greatest and most influential PC games of all time. As you play Half-Life, it's clear where specific elements of later shooter games pulled heavy inspiration, such as the infectious alien race found in Halo, the audio of enemy forces found in Killzone, and the general foundation of gameplay found in Far Cry, BioShock, and Call of Duty. That's not even to mention Valve's own future franchises such as Portal and Left 4 Dead. In fact, if you were to play nearly any single-player first-person shooter released from 1999 until today, you could probably find some aspect of it that, quote-unquote, feels like Half-Life. If items are sitting on a shelf instead of just positioned very purposefully on the ground, you can thank Half-Life for that. Companion NPCs who cover you, heal you, and open specific doors while you protect them, also introduced in Half-Life. Unlike the experiences found in Doom and Quake, Half-Life wasn't about running from enemy to enemy until you found enough keys to reach the exit. This was now a whole action adventure, simply told using the structure of the first-person shooter. That is what's so great about Half-Life. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we took a look at what's really going on in Half-Life. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Metal Gear Solid, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.